All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our virtual town hall primary election preview with Yinka Faleti, who is the Democratic nominee for Missouri Secretary of State. I am Connor Kerrigan. I am Yinka's communications director, and I'm very, very excited to be here with you all. So today, Yinka is going to be talking about the primary election that is coming up on August 4th. Now, Yinka doesn't have a primary challenger for the Secretary of State's office on the Democratic side, but there's still other races going on. And one of the big things that we really want to talk about is that Medicaid expansion is on the ballot on August 4th. It is Amendment 2, and we are letting you know that you should vote yes on Amendment 2, and Yinka will let you know why. So, without further interruption, I would like to introduce Missouri's next Secretary of State, Yinka Faleti.
Well, Connor, thank you so much for that introduction. As Connor shared, my name is Yinka Faleti. I am the Democratic nominee for Missouri Secretary of State, meaning I have no challenger in the August primary. I am be facing the Republican incumbent, Jay Ashcroft, in the November election. And I want to thank you for tuning in this evening. You could be doing anything in this period of time, but you've chosen to be here this evening, and I couldn't be more grateful. You know, we are living in times of unprecedented upheaval within the last 100 years. I mean, in terms of the modern era, we haven't seen anything like the COVID-19 pandemic that we're experiencing now. This is the most dangerous and lethal pandemic since the 1918 flu pandemic. We've seen recent killings of unarmed Black Americans, and those killings have spurred the largest protest movement in our nation's history. For example, on June 6th, nearly 500,000 people took to the streets, mostly peacefully, in 550 different places across the United States. This has left Americans wrestling with the chasm caused by COVID-19. We have seen just a tremendous amount of disparities in our country. And this COVID-19 pandemic has really exposed all of the myriad amount of chasms from economic, from social, from healthcare. In so many ways, so much has been exposed by this. And Americans are being faced with the undeniable evidence of systemic racism in our country that Black Americans have been dealing with for hundreds of years. And Americans are wondering now how they will be able to vote safely during this pandemic. People are debating whether they should send their children to school this fall. And if they choose not to for good health reasons, what alternatives there will be to educate their children. Many folks have lost their jobs, or if they haven't lost their job altogether, they've seen their hours severely reduced. Folks of all, blue collar, white collar, all manner of professions have seen a loss of economic viability in their industries. And still others are wondering what happens when their unemployment runs out. Missourians are looking to leadership at the national level, and they see none. They're looking for leadership at the state level, and they see a governor saying that kids will get COVID when they go back to school, that it's okay, and that they'll simply get over it. Missourians are looking to the Secretary of State of Missouri to ensure that they can vote safely during this pandemic and not have to risk their health to exercise their most fundamental of American rights. And they see no leadership there either. They see a Secretary of State who has failed to prepare the state, who has failed to ensure that during this pandemic, Missourians will be able to vote safely and securely. And so the people of this country and the people of Missouri are looking to make a change. And that's why you see so many folks protesting all over this country and all over our state. And the folks protesting are beginning a movement. And that movement must ultimately culminate in the ballot box. We have to make a change, and we have to make a change in our leadership. And that change will begin when we begin to elect different leaders at the federal level when we begin to elect different leaders at the state level. What I want to do tonight is a couple of things. One, I want to share with you a bit more about me. You heard Connor talk about my candidacy for Secretary of State of Missouri. I want to tell you who I am, why I'm running for this post, and the vision that I have for Missouri should I be so honored to be elected as her next Secretary of State. And then I want to talk to you about the upcoming primary election on August 4th and some of the important issues that are going to be decided by your choice, by your voice in that election. So let me start by just sharing a bit about me. When you see my name and you hear my name, Yinka Faleti, you probably figure there's an origin to that name that didn't necessarily originate within the 50 states. You would be correct. I was born in Lagos, Nigeria. I immigrated to the US when I was 7 years old. I earned my American citizenship as a youth. My family was not one of those rich Nigerian families that folks seem to think about Nigerians who immigrate here. We were actually quite poor, and we moved around a lot as a kid, but we finally settled in Texas, where I went to high school. And so from Texas, I earned my citizenship, and then I earned my appointment to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. I graduated West Point in 1998, and I was commissioned as an officer in the Army, specifically in the armor branch. So I served on tanks and in tank units my entire 6 years plus on active duty. Many of us will remember a guy named Saddam Hussein, and will remember that he was not a very nice person, and just was someone that the world was better without. And so we deployed from Fort Hood, Texas to Kuwait in 2001. And my job was to lead our soldiers to keep him at bay and to ensure that he would not think about invading Kuwait again. And so we did that. And we had a great mission. We came back with all of our soldiers intact. And we got back to Fort Hood in August of '01. And we all remember what happened the very next month in September of 2001. So many of our fellow Americans were slain and our country was attacked. And so after that, our unit was asked to go back to Kuwait to help defend our country. And I was proud to be part of a small group of people who could do something about the September 11 attacks. And so we went right back to Kuwait, and I found myself right back in the same deserts that I'd been in just a few weeks prior. And it was a terrific mission. It really felt good to defend the country in that time. So we come back to Fort Hood and fast forward to 2004. And I am at Fort Knox, Kentucky. I'm a company commander training the newest soldiers in the Army. And the job of my company was to get those soldiers ready for war, because we knew that every single one of those soldiers that we were training, that they were headed to war. And they weren't headed to war in some time. They were headed to war right after they left us. So we took our jobs very, very seriously, and was proud to know that, to feel good that we had prepared them properly as part of my command. So I leave the Army after that. I leave the Army in 2004. I leave as a captain. I moved to St. Louis, Missouri, and I moved here for law school at Washington University. And my plan was to study for 3 years and then go back into the Army and serve as an Army JAG. That was a plan, but they say life is what happens while you're busy planning. And so instead of going back in the Army, I went to a law firm, a global law firm based out of here in St. Louis called Bryan Cave. Now it's Bryan Cave at Leighton Pacer. And I did product liability litigation, commercial litigation was my practice. And it was exciting work. I was working with some terrific lawyers. But after a few years, I really began to miss the larger than life service mission that I had in the Army. And I wanted to get back to service. And so I figured I'd use my newfound legal skills and use them to help people. So I went to be a state prosecutor at the Circuit Attorney's Office, helping victims of crime. My very first jury trial was helping an 11-year-old boy who was being shown pornography by his teacher in the classroom. That was my first jury trial. And it was the trial of a lifetime. As you can imagine, to get the 11-year-old boy to talk to me, to share with me what he'd experienced, the things he'd seen, how his teacher had victimized him at 11 years old, to get the family's trust. It was incredible. And that boy took the stand in a large courtroom in front of an intimidating jury of 12 adults. You can imagine from the perspective of an 11-year-old boy, and a judge in a black robe. And he took the stand, and with poise was able to talk about what had happened to him. And with the help of him, his family, and our investigators, got the conviction, and it felt terrific. And the thank you that I got from that family and that little boy is one that stays with me for life. And so this was my beginning. This is how I started as a prosecutor. That case was relatively early in my tenure as a prosecutor. But after a few years there, most of my cases were not child sex abuse cases. Most of my cases were gun and drug cases. And I began to realize after a few years that I was really too late. I was too late for the victim in almost every situation, because I was coming in after the crime had already occurred. The victim had already been victimized. I was trying to give the victim a sense of justice, but I was ultimately too late. I began to realize I was also too late for the defendant, because before somebody is 19 and 20 burglarizing or assaulting, they're 17 and 15 and 11, 13 and 8. And my own son is 8, and my daughter is 5, and my younger daughter is 3. And I began to think, what if at 8 and 5 and 3, we're investing in early childhood education in that family unit, in that community? When that young man is 19 or 20, they're not burglarizing or assaulting. They're about to graduate college. They're dreaming of starting their own business one day or doing something great with their life. And I began to realize I needed to get from the back end to the front. I looked to the front and I saw United Way of Greater St. Louis. So I went there and I led as senior VP the division that raised the money for United Way. And in 4 years, led our team to raise $300 million for the Greater St. Louis region. Now, obviously, I didn't do that by myself. Nobody can raise that amount of money by themselves. I had a terrific team. I had great volunteers. And I began to realize, and I loved the job. I mean, we raised money that helped a child be the first in their family to go to college, helped a child with autism get the services he or she needed, helped an elderly loved one with dementia or with Alzheimer's get the services they needed. It was the best job. And I probably would still be there. Except after several years there, I began to realize that we'd raised a ton of money. $300 million in 4 years is a large amount of money. And we still had so many challenges in our region. And I needed to get to the root causes. What was causing people to need the help in the first place? Now, hear me. United Way is very, very critical in our community and communities all over this country. We need strong United Ways. But I wanted to get to the root causes. And so I went to lead a nonprofit called Forward Through Ferguson, a successor nonprofit to the Ferguson Commission after the Michael Brown shooting. And I knew that this was not going to be the feel-good work of United Way. No one was going to pat me on the back for raising millions of dollars. This was instead going to be long-term, generational, entrenched work to try to undo generations of systemic inequities in the Greater St. Louis region. That was the mission. And I was up for it. But after a bit, I began to realize that many, not all, but many of the issues we were working on, when we pulled the thread back on those issues, the thread ended at the state level. Education in Missouri, the funding formula is set at the state level. Healthcare in Missouri, Medicaid expansion, state level decision. I needed to get to the state level. And that's why I'm running. And specifically for Secretary of State, because that is where the fight is. That's the frontier for democracy in our state, and quite frankly, in our country. If, as we do now in Jay Ashcroft, the current secretary, we have a Secretary of State that's making it harder to vote, erecting artificial barriers, and just causing people to go through unnecessary hoops to vote and exercise their most fundamental right, it makes it virtually impossible to make change and to move our state forward. And that's why I'm running for Secretary of State. We have all had a front row seat to what happened in Georgia when Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp were vying for governor there. Brian Kemp was Georgia's Secretary of State, and Stacey Abrams was running against him. And you'll recall that it was a very, very close race. But Brian Kemp did not beat Stacey Abrams in 2018 when he was Secretary of State running for governor. Brian Kemp beat Stacey Abrams in 2017, 2016, 15, 14, 13, and so on when he was Secretary of State and erasing legitimate and valid voters off the rolls. That's what voter suppression looks like today. And we have our own Brian Kemp here in Missouri, and his name is Jay Ashcroft. And we are tired of voter suppression in Missouri. Voter suppression is not what it used to look like. It does not look like folks having to pass a literacy test like many Black Americans were made to undergo. It does not look like folks having to guess the number of jelly beans in a jar that happened to many Black Americans long ago. Not too long ago. It does not look like that anymore. It does not look like dogs being set at polling places to intimidate people. Today, it looks like policies and procedures that are designed, calculated, and calibrated to keep people from being able to vote so that only certain people can vote and others cannot. And we will not stand for that as Missourians. We will not stand for that as Americans. And that's why I'm running to be Missouri's next Secretary of State. So thank you again for being here. If you are just joining us, please look in the chat, check out the links, sign up for our mailing list. And yes, you can contribute. We would certainly appreciate your contribution. Look in the chat. Turn now to talk about a couple of big items that will be on the August 4th primary. And by the way, if you are in Missouri watching us, today is the last day to request your ballot from your mail-in ballot. So please make sure you get that in. The deadline was 5 p.m. So make sure that you got that in today so that you can get your mail-in ballot if you are in Missouri. So on the August 4th ballot, it's a very, very important primary election in Missouri. Missouri is one of just a few states that have not expanded Medicaid. Right now, I believe 37 states have expanded Medicaid, including Missouri's neighbor to our east, Illinois, and most recently, Missouri's neighbor to our west, Kansas, and just a few weeks ago, our neighbor to the southwest in Oklahoma. Oklahomans, by ballot initiative, approved Medicaid expansion in their state. And in Missouri, we have not approved Medicaid expansion. And this is an issue of supreme importance to Missourians who live in urban areas and Missourians who live in rural areas. So let me break it down a bit. Right now, we as Missourians pay tax dollars to the federal government, about $500 million a year of our tax dollars that could be going toward Medicaid expansion. Other states like California, like New York, like Illinois, like Kansas, now Oklahoma, when those states pay their tax dollars out, they get some of them back to help them expand Medicaid. And we do not. And yet in Missouri, we have a healthcare crisis on our hands. In fact, in Missouri, we have a tremendous healthcare crisis. Since 2014, 10 rural hospitals have closed in Missouri since 2014. And when rural hospitals close, that means, unfortunately, that means people die. And that's because they have to drive too far to get the help they need, the medical attention they need when they have an emergency. Imagine being forced to wake up in the middle of the night because you have a physical emergency and you have to drive 2 hours round trip just to see a doctor. It's untenable and it makes no sense, but it doesn't have to be that way. We don't have to have rural hospitals closing in Missouri. We can expand Medicaid so that we can cover up to 230,000 additional Missourians who make $18,000 or less. And that would not only help those Missourians, but it would help all of us, because it means that we're not having to, folks aren't having to go to the emergency room as their primary care, which many people unfortunately do now. They use the emergency room as their primary care. It means that we have more jobs. We bring back jobs to the state. It means that we get to invest in our rural areas and in our urban areas. So we need to do a much better job in terms of healthcare. And one way to do that is to expand Medicaid to cover more Missourians. One of the things that people talk about when they talk about Medicaid, one of the arguments is that, Medicaid expansion only helps certain Missourians. It doesn't help all Missourians. Actually, just about 24% of Missouri's population lives in what we call a rural area. The remainder of Missouri lives in urban areas. But 33% of Missourians would benefit from Medicaid expansion. So this is something that would significantly help people in rural Missouri, but it would also help people in the urban areas as well. So Medicaid expansion is very, very important. Right now, we as a state are spending providing a 40% match for folks on Medicaid. When we expand Medicaid, the federal government would cover 90% of the cost, and the state would only have to do a 10% match. We would create jobs. We would ensure that more of our Missourians are covered. So Medicaid expansion is supremely important, and I encourage you strongly to vote yes on Amendment 2 to vote for a Medicaid expansion on August 4th. The other issue that I want to talk about is the candidates on the August 4th election. Now, I am one of those candidates. As I shared with you, I'm running for Missouri Secretary of State, but I do not have a primary challenger. So when you go to vote, you will see my name alone, but please, I still need your vote. I still want your vote. So please circle the oval next to my name and vote for me for Secretary of State. But in addition, we have an important election for governor. Nicole Galloway is the Democrat running for governor, and she has 4 primary challengers. You have two candidates running for Attorney General. You have the candidate running for treasurer. Vicki England, is unchallenged. She, like me, has no primary challenger. And then you also have 2 candidates running for lieutenant governor. So a lot of important posts to decide for Missourians. And as we are seeing now, elections have consequences. It matters who we vote in our state government. We are seeing decisions of healthcare being made by state leaders or not being made by state leaders. We are seeing decisions in terms of protecting people with common sense policies during a global pandemic being made or not being made by state leaders. We've seen decisions with respect to voting being made or not being made by our state leaders who are not preparing us to be able to vote safely this August and this November, when they should have been doing that a long time ago. So we want to make sure that you get out to vote. In St. Louis County, St. Louis County announced just earlier today that you can vote in St. Louis County anywhere, at any polling location in St. Louis County if you choose to vote by mail. This is the kind of thing that we can do all across the state of Missouri, where you can vote anywhere you find yourself on election day, and you don't have to necessarily be constrained to the polling place in your neighborhood or that is assigned to you. So these are a couple of the issues that are really very, very important on the August 4th primary. Now, depending on where you live in the state, there might be some other local issues to you. I know in St. Louis County, there's a Proposition C initiative, and there's some other local issues. But as far as statewide issues, those are the 2 most important ones: Medicaid expansion, Amendment 2, and then election voting for primaries for the statewide elected offices that I mentioned earlier. So again, if you are just joining us, thank you so much for being with us this evening. My name is Yinka Faleti. I am the Democratic nominee for Missouri Secretary of State. We have links in the chat and in our bio. on the platform that you're on. Please click on the links. You can join our mailing list. You can learn more about our campaign, and you can absolutely contribute to our campaign. So, and I encourage you to contribute to our campaign. No amount is too small, whether you can give $25 or $50 or $100 or $5 or $1, whatever it is that is within your means, would greatly appreciate it. It'll go a long way to helping us be in a position to win in August and November and end voter suppression in the state of Missouri. So I will pause there. I know that we have some questions that folks have posed ahead of time. So I'm going to pause there. I'm going to turn it over to Connor, our communications director, to facilitate those questions that some of you have submitted ahead of time. And certainly if you have a fresh question, please put it in the chat, and we would love to answer your questions live as well. Connor?
Yes, hello, Yinka. So the first question is, what are the most urgent voting rights issues in Missouri, and how would you address them as Secretary of State?
Well, thank you for that question. You know, in Missouri, we are unfortunately still voting as if we were in the early 1900s. And unfortunately for that scheme, it's 2020, and we need to vote like we are living in the 21st century. And so one of the things that's been on my mind is ensuring vote access to voters, to voting for all eligible Missourians. Right now, that's the number one issue. Too many Missourians do not have ready access to the ballot. We have less and less polling places throughout the state. We have, because of the pandemic, there are less people volunteering to be poll workers. So we have a shortage of poll workers. We do not have no excuse vote by mail. We're one of just a few states that do not have that. And what that means is, no excuse means you can vote by mail without having to have a specific excuse or legal excuse. That if you want to vote by mail, you can. And we don't have that in Missouri. In fact, right now, what we have is a limited vote by mail measure that passed out of our state legislature in May, and the governor signed into law in June. But that limited vote by mail measure allows only those allows folks who are 65 years and older to vote by mail without a notary, or if they have certain specific underlying health conditions that are specified in the law, they can vote by mail without a notary. But for most Missourians who will not necessarily have those specific health conditions and those limited health conditions, and most Missourians who are 64 and younger, they can vote by mail, but they still have to find a notary. Now, you know, I don't know about you, but finding a notary is not easy. You know, notaries are not like Walgreens. There is not one on every corner. You know, you have to find a notary. You have to make an appointment with the notary. You have to leave your home, go to the notary, potentially expose yourself if that person has COVID and they're unawares because they're asymptomatic, or in transit, you come in contact with someone, or you yourself have COVID-19, but don't know it because you're asymptomatic. It's just fraught with all kinds of risk. During the time when the CDC guidance and all of the respectable health professionals in our state and our country are telling us the best thing we can do is shelter at home and only leave the house when we absolutely have to. You know, some people have to work out of the home, many people do. And of course we have to buy groceries and such. But otherwise, this is the time to really shelter at home so we can slow the spread. And we know that the numbers are rising, that we have not contained COVID-19 in this country. In fact, the numbers are unfortunately rising because of the lack of leadership at the federal level and at the state level. So this is not the time for Missourians to have to be worrying about trying to find a notary. And so that's a big problem that's on my mind. You know, the other thing that's on my mind in terms of voting is, you know, we ought to have automatic voter registration. You know, states like Colorado, when you go to a state office, like a driver's license office, and you're automatically registered through that process. You know, when you turn 18 in this country, You're automatically opted in to pay taxes. Why shouldn't you be automatically opted in to vote? We need to have that in our state so that we make voting more accessible. Right now in Missouri, we, folks, if let's say our young people, someone lives in St. Louis, but they go to school, to college at the University of Missouri in Columbia. Well, while they're in Columbia, they might be registered in St. Louis, but if they want to vote in Columbia, they'll have to re-register in Columbia. Why should you have to re-register? Why not just be able to vote anywhere you are in the state? Those are things that we ought to have, that we can do, that would make voting more accessible for more Missourians. Some of the other things we can do is same-day registration. You ought to be able to register when you go to vote, if you vote in person or if you vote otherwise. Why can't you do that? Well, you can't do that because we haven't made it possible by our laws, and that is voter suppression. These are some of the things that we can do. They're not radical. They're not new. They're being done by other states. We are one of just a few states that don't have no excuse vote by mail. And we ought to be able to vote by mail, not just during the global pandemic and not in this limited way. We ought to be able to vote by mail all the time. The current law, this limited vote by mail law, sunsets on December 31st of this year. So come January 1 of 2021, we go back to the old way of voting. Again, as I described, as if we're in the early 1900s. We need to come into the 21st century. People ought to be able to vote by mail at any time, not just during the global pandemic. And they need to be able to vote by mail without a notary. Having to get a notary to get your ballot notarized. That is voter suppression. It's unacceptable, and there's no reason for it. So these are some of the things that we can do to make voting more accessible, because that's the number one problem in Missouri right now. Thanks for that question. That's the number one problem with respect to voting.
Yeah, thank you for that, Yinka. And I just want to let everyone know that if you have a question, you are more than encouraged to post it in the comments, and we should get an answer to you. So you talked about this a little, but I want you to expand a little bit on it, Yinka. As Secretary of State, what would be your first action to increase voter protection in the state?
Yeah, so the first thing I would do in terms of voter protection is I would push for greater access for Missouri voters. Voters right now, our voices are not being heard because we don't have an opportunity to exercise our voice. There are many folks who are homeless and don't have an address. It's almost impossible for them to vote. There are folks who are elderly and shut in. It's so difficult for those folks to get to their polling place because of their disability. There are folks who are because of their age. There are folks who are disabled, and it's very, very difficult for them to get to their polling place. Our young people, our college age students and young people who are transient because they're in college. It's very, very difficult because as they move from one locale to another, they have to re-register. So the first thing I would do is ensure that voting is more accessible. And one of the ways we can do that is with absentee voting and vote by mail. As I said earlier, we have to be able to vote by mail all the time, not just during a global pandemic. And you should not, as a Missourian, have to decide between your health or your life and exercising your fundamental right to vote. As a Missourian, you ought to be able to vote safely and securely. It ought to be accessible. And the fact that it is not accessible is to every Missourian is just ridiculous. Let me give you an example. Missouri is every state, and Missouri is one of the states that every state gets money from the federal government to enable that state to do elections and to do all the things that are necessary to be able to have safe, secure, and accessible elections. And we all remember that the Senate Intelligence Committee last summer concluded that all 50 states, Missouri included, that foreign actors had tried to interfere with our elections. And you saw no action from our current Secretary of State, who's supposed to be the primary promoter of democracy in our state, the primary protector of elections. In fact, our current Secretary of State was sitting on $7 million that was given to Missouri by the federal government between 2018, 2020, and separately through the CARES Act of 2020. $7 million. And from the most recent records that we've been able to get a hold of, from October of 2018 to September of 2019, the current Secretary of State doled out only about $500,000 of that $7 million. Now let's pause on that. Imagine if you are the person tasked with ensuring that elections in a state of 6 million people are safe, secure, and accessible. Imagine if the federal government has transferred to you $7 million. And imagine if nothing was done with those $7 million through September of 2019. How derelict is that? How dangerous is that? That is completely irresponsible. And that's the kind of secretary we have now. He does not care about safe, secure, and accessible elections, because if he did in Missouri, he would have taken those $7 million and prior to September of 2019 would have been doling them out to the various local election authorities throughout the state. And had he done so, Missouri would be in a much better situation right now in terms of having more polling places, having more poll workers, having an opportunity to do vote by mail in a robust way, so that the local election authorities aren't scrambling at the last minute to make this work for Missouri citizens. They would have been prepared long ago. And it wouldn't be 2020 that they're just preparing to enact vote by mail throughout the state. This is why elections matter. And let me say this as well. We've all heard the phrase, vote like your life depends on it. That has never been truer than right now. Our lives literally depend on who we elect in office. And as I said earlier, if we have a Secretary of State that is doing things like sitting on money that could have gone to local election authorities prior to September 2019, is doing things like failing even during the most global and dangerous and lethal global pandemic in 100 years, refusing to facilitate vote by mail on the day that our state legislature passed that limited vote by mail measure in May earlier this year. The Secretary of State, Jay Ashcroft, stated in writing that he's against vote by mail. Pause on that. In the most dangerous and lethal global pandemic in 100 years, he would have you risk your health and your life to go vote when he could facilitate vote by mail. That's the kind of secretary we have right now. That's not democracy. That's not what Missourians want. And that's why I'm running against him to be your next Secretary of State. Thank you for that question.
Awesome. So the next question we have is about Medicaid expansion. So you touched on this a little when you were initially talking about it, but one of the questions that we got was, where do the funds come from for Medicaid expansion? So we know there's a federal state split, but can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. And again, if you are just joining us, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Yinka Faleti. I am the Democratic nominee for Missouri Secretary of State. We have in our bio and in the chat some links where you can learn more about our campaign. You can sign up for our mailing list and you can contribute to our campaign. No amount is too small, whether it's $5 or $100 or $25, whatever is within your means, please contribute to our campaign so we can end voter suppression. We can get to voter inclusion for all eligible Missourians across our state. So with respect to Medicaid expansion, right now, 10% of the funds would, if we expanded Medicaid, 10% of the funds would come from Missouri's general revenue, so from our state budget. But 90% of the funds would come from the federal government. And right now, Missouri is providing a 40% match for a big chunk of the Medicaid population. And you're talking about reducing that match to a much more affordable 10%. So this is a big deal for our state. And when you think about states all across this country and Missouri who are now being affected adversely by COVID-19 because of decreased tax revenues, we're looking for opportunities, smart ways to save. Now, a smart way to save is not to cut back on education. That's not what we're talking about. A smart way to save is to expand Medicaid so that we can cover more Missourians. We can provide a healthier Missouri. We can provide a healthier workforce. We can decrease the number of people who are going to the emergency room and using the emergency room as their primary care physician. We can stop the closure of rural hospitals, 10 rural hospitals closing since 2014 in Missouri. I mean, that's just astounding. And half of those hospitals are in Southeast Missouri, which is one of the poorest regions of the state, the very region of the state that doesn't need to have their hospitals closed and needs help. So these are things that we can do, and we can, if we pass Amendment 2 on August 4th, we can join the 37 other states that have already expanded Medicaid, including our neighbors, Illinois and Kansas, and most recently, Oklahoma to our southwest. And we can make sure we cover more Missourians, and we have a healthier state and a more prosperous state because of it.
Awesome, thank you. So this next one, we've talked about this before, Yinka, but the state of Maine has a system of voting called ranked choice voting. So can you talk a little bit about ranked choice voting and what you think about it and how it might have some relevance to Missouri?
Yeah, so ranked choice voting, abbreviated RCV, ranked choice voting is a really innovative way to vote that gets more voters who they want. Right now, I'll give an example. In St. Louis City, we had a recent election where the person who won for a local election won the election. It was virtually a three-way tie, almost. Each of the three leading candidates had about 33% of the vote, and the candidate who won just happened to have 34% of the vote, and they won with 34% of the vote. And so you have, in that example, if someone won with 34% of the vote, well, that means over 60% of the voters didn't vote for that person. And so, but this happens not just in St. Louis City or Missouri, it happens all over the country. And so ranked choice voting is a way to get more voters happy with who they elected. Because what it does is it gives voters, as the name implies, an opportunity to rank their choices. So they can have candidates A, B, and C, and they can rank candidate B as their number one, candidate C is their number two, candidate A is their number three. And so everybody votes in that way, they rank their choices. And then if a candidate comes out and has a majority of the electorate, they win. But if they don't, then we take out the person with the least number of votes, and then we go again. You look at the numbers again. And so it's just a really innovative way to do this. Maine is the only state right now that does this statewide. There are locales, municipalities all over the country that do this, but as far as statewide, Maine is the only one that does this. And Maine will be this November the only state that will as of now, the only state that will decide the next president or help decide the next president using this method of voting. So again, it's very, very innovative. Now, as far as yeah, and in fact, right now in Maine, it's so popular that more than 74% of precincts had 54% of voters or more in favor of this. So it's pretty popular in Maine. In terms of Missouri, should I be honored to be your next Secretary of State? This is not something that I would or could decide unilaterally. This is something that I would present to the people of Missouri to decide if this is something we want in our state. It's got a lot of pros. Of course, no system is perfect, but there are a lot of good things about it. But I think it's up to the people. And so I would put it up to the people of Missouri to decide if we want ranked choice voting in our state. But the people of Maine love it, and we'll see how it goes for them this November in terms of deciding the president with it.
Great, thank you. And so again, I just want to encourage everyone, if there's a question that you have for Yinka, this is your next Secretary of State, so now's a great time to ask a question. One that we got in the comments, Yinka, and you and I have discussed this before, is what is the potential for voter fraud from expanding the opportunities to vote by mail? Does vote by mail put the election integrity at risk?
Yeah, so this is the voter fraud phrase is something you hear from folks who poo-poo vote by mail and who are down on it, and we've heard comments from the highest office in the land, and this is unsupported. These claims of voter fraud because of using the vote by mail are completely unsubstantiated. They are false and they are fabricated. There have been no recorded cases of voter fraud associated with vote by mail in Missouri. And across the country, they are minuscule to almost to the point of being non-existent. It is made up by those who do not want a vote by mail to try to discourage and to try to dissuade and to try to continue to suppress votes. Let's just be plain and clear about that. Vote by mail, let me give you an example. This year, all of us, just about everybody in the country who has a mailing address, received in the mail a letter from the US Census Bureau. Let's pause on this. The census is done once every 10 years. The census is responsible for determining so many things: districting, how lines are drawn up, how number of representatives you have in your state, the number of aid that's given to your state based on population, and so much more. I mean, literally trillions of dollars are riding on the census. So it's so important to have an accurate count. We received the census letter by mail. Most of us completed our census online. Don't tell me we can't vote by mail. So those who try to put up this falsehood about vote by mail, those people don't want you to vote. They're trying to suppress votes, plain and simple. There are no recorded cases of fraud associated with vote by mail in Missouri. And again, across the country, they're minuscule. And what would happen if we did vote by mail instead, like a state like Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and others that have vote by mail now and have recorded almost no voter fraud with vote by mail. Those states are doing this very, very well. And what they see, particularly Colorado, they've seen increased voter engagement. They've seen more people engaged in the democratic process, which is what we want for our country. They've seen, and vote by mail does not benefit either party. There is no benefit to either Democrats or Republicans because of vote by mail. The only beneficiary of vote by mail is the American citizen who gets to exercise their voice and their choice. Let me be clear on this. As I shared with you at the outset, and if you didn't join at the outset, perhaps you missed it. I'm an immigrant American. I was born in Lagos, Nigeria, and I became a citizen as a youth. So I didn't have my American citizenship automatically. I had to earn it. And I didn't have my right to vote automatically. I had to earn it. And I defended that right to vote for all Americans. When I served in our US Army for over 6 years on active duty and 2 tours to Kuwait. So when I signed that blank check, and when my fellow soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, and women signed that blank check, and the folks who are serving today still continue to sign that blank check as they don the uniform every day, they do not sign a blank check. We did not sign a blank check so that only some Americans could vote, so that only a limited subset of Missourians could vote. I signed that blank check, and the service members serving today sign the blank check every day they don the uniform, so that all Americans can vote, and so that all eligible Missourians can vote. And so let me be, this is a very personal point for me. Those who continue to push the agenda, those who continue to lie to us and try to make us believe that vote by mail is somehow risky or fraught with potential opportunity for voter fraud. Those people are slapping in the face service members who have served so that our country could be a democracy. That being a democracy is what sets us apart from so many other countries on the face of our planet. And the bedrock of our democracy is our right to vote. So I take it personal when we have people who are supposed to be leaders who are promoting these lies about vote by mail. There is no recorded case of vote by mail fraud in the state of Missouri. And so we need to end that lie right now. But thank you for that question.
All right, awesome. And one of the questions that we got in the comments, Yinka, was, do you support restoring voting rights for people who are incarcerated? So obviously, as Secretary of State, this is something that you'll be working with. So what are your thoughts on that?
So this is an issue that's so important. Across the country, we have so many folks behind bars, whether they're in jails or they're in prisons. In Missouri, we have too many. Missouri, actually, if Missouri were a country, Missouri would have one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. That is not a good statistic. That is a sad statistic for our state. And the folks who are incarcerated, many who are in jails are people who have been charged with a crime but have not yet been convicted of a crime. And those people who have not yet been convicted of a crime can vote. But all too often in our system, they're not afforded the opportunity to vote because they're not educated about their right to vote. Many think they cannot because they've been charged with a crime. Remember, in our country, we have the presumption of innocence, that you are innocent until proven guilty. And while you are yet innocent, you have all rights attended to you as a citizen of this country. And we ought to start treating people who have not yet been convicted of a crime that way. But even for those who have been convicted of a crime, once that person has served their time, they have paid their penance under the law, my goodness, they ought to be afforded all the rights attendant to a returning citizen in our country. Right now, Missouri has signed into law that takes us backward in terms of our criminal justice. We were, as a country and as a state, on a slow but better path to criminal justice reform. We have taken a step back with the recent law that has been signed into law. So I support voting rights for people, for returning citizens who have served their time, who've paid their penance. They ought to be able to fully partake in our democracy. And if we allowed returning citizens to fully engage in our democracy, this would actually help reduce the rate of recidivism. Because when you have a stake in something, you want to be part of that thing. But when you have no stake, it's easier to slip back and land right back in jail or prison. And we don't want that. And so I'm in favor of ensuring our returning citizens can engage by being able to vote and fully vote and fully engage in our democratic process in Missouri. Thanks for that question.
Great. And we're near the end here, Yinka, but it looks like we've got one more question from the chat that I want to make sure that you see. So the question is about approval voting, which is on the ballot in St. Louis City as Proposition D. So we know that Rasheen Aldridge, Tashwara Jones, Denise Lieberman, who's one of our state's leading voting rights experts, all support this proposition. So just your thoughts on Prop D and approval voting.
Yeah, so right now you have that is on the ballot, and I know we have terrific support from some of those names you mentioned. Denise Lieberman is just foremost authority in all things voting throughout our state and throughout Missouri, and so I think approval voting is something that should the voters of St. Louis City decide to enact, I think it's something worthy of trying. We have to make voting a process that produces a better result. Right now, the way that we vote, not only on the federal level, we've long known that on the federal level, that the results we've had over the last 20 years, 20, 30 years, in some of our presidential elections and other elections have not produced results that the majority of the people wanted. We need to look no further back than 2016, when the current occupant of the White House failed to win the popular vote by nearly 3 million Americans. And yet is in the White House. And so voters can't be happy with that, because that does not seem fair. It seems like someone we did not vote for. So any measure that allows voters to have a greater level of satisfaction with the outcome is something we ought to give a chance to. And so I think approval rating, to the extent the citizens of St. Louis City want to approve it, I think they ought to have that opportunity. So I'm glad to see it on the ballot, and we'll see what happens with it on August 4th.
Great, and we're creeping up on the 1 hour mark now. So Yinka, all I want to do is turn over to you for any closing remarks that you might have.
Well, Connor, thank you so much. And thank you to all who have joined us this evening. Again, I'm so appreciative of your support just by being here. And again, in the chat and in our bio, you will have an opportunity to sign up for our mailing list. You have an opportunity to learn more about our campaign. You have an opportunity to contribute. No amount is too great. No amount is too small. Whether you can do $100, $25, $5, $1, $50, whatever is within your means, please contribute. I am running to ensure that all eligible Missourians have the opportunity to vote. I'm running to ensure that we do not have artificial barriers erected for people to vote. I'm running to ensure that during the most most dangerous and lethal global pandemic in 100 years, that all Missourians have safe, secure access to their voice through their vote. That is what our country was founded on. That is the principles that led to the Boston Tea Party. We have to have a voice. We have to have representation, and we ought to have representation as voters, and we ought to be able to do it without unnecessary barriers. And those folks who are trying to erect artificial barriers, who are trying to make laws that have nothing to do with securing anything, who are trying to not allow you to vote by mail, like our current Secretary of State, who is against vote by mail on the record, in writing, those folks are not for democracy. And I did not fight in our Army, and soldiers and sailors today are not fighting in our Army and in our Air Force and in our Navy and in our Marines so that only some of us can vote. All eligible Missourians, all American citizens ought to be able to vote without hindrance, without unnecessary burdens, without unnecessary hurdles. And we ought to make sure that our election is safe, secure, and accessible. And that's why I'm running to vote. But we will need your help. We are running against an opponent that has a dynastic name in Missouri politics. We are running against an opponent that will have a lot of dark money, will have a lot of special interest going for him. But we have a secret weapon, and our secret weapon is you, the people of the state of Missouri and the people of this country. Our secret weapon is grassroots support from everyday Missourians, everyday Americans who want to see our country remain a democracy, who do not like the direction our country is headed in and want significant and fundamental change. That is the statement of the protest that we are seeing all over our country, all of our state. People want change, and change ultimately funnels into the ballot box. If we cannot elect leaders who would unite us and not divide us, leaders who would bring us together, leaders who would lead us in the right direction, follow science so that we are healthier, safer, more prosperous. If we cannot elect those leaders, we cannot move forward. And being able to elect those leaders has everything to do with being able to vote safely, securely in August and in November and always. And that's why I'm running to be Missouri's next Secretary of State. Thank you so much. I'm so honored that you're here. I hope to have your vote on August 4th, and I hope to have your vote again on November 3rd. I look forward to staying in contact with you. Have a great rest of your evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye-bye.